of you will probably be asking the question, well, look, we've heard lots of wonderful talks about the present and the future, but why on earth do we need to think about something that happened 2,500 years ago or thereabouts? Isn't that just all history? Isn't that all just in the past? Isn't that all just irrelevant now? Well, I'm going to be arguing today that it's not irrelevant, that what we need to do if we're going to understand the present, and certainly if we're going to understand the future and indeed make changes for the future that we need to make that are going to be positive, we need to understand the past. And this is a past that is, in one sense, although of course it happened at a particular point, at a particular place, that some of us might not feel connected to, it is nevertheless a very, very important moment in European history. Not only European history, but indeed in world history. And I think that in various ways we can all learn something from it. Now, I'm going to begin with this term democracy. And we use this word democracy in the modern world. Sometimes sort of quite casually without really knowing what this word means. The word democracy comes from two Greek words. One of them is demos, meaning people. The other one is kratos, meaning power. So a demokratia is literally a people power, right? Which means that the entire citizen body is responsible for its government, for its self-government, unlike alternative forms of government. Let's just think about the most important form of government, the alternative to democracy in the classical Greek world, was something that, again, it comes from two Greek words, oligarchy. Oligos, meaning few, arche, meaning the rule. Oligarchy was the rule not of the whole of the people, but a small subsection of the people, a group of elite citizens defined either by their birth or by their wealth or something of that kind. And we know that the Greek world, in the 5th century BC, which is the period of history we're going to be talking about, was divided between those societies that practiced democratic rule and those societies that practiced oligarchic rule. Okay, so what do we mean by democracy? Well, we mean a system in which everybody has an equal share. Now, I'm going to think here about the ancient understanding of democracy, not the modern understanding of democracy. We're going to talk about the ancient understanding of democracy and what it's meant, and then we're going to sort of think a little bit about differences between the ancient understanding and the modern understanding. Let's think about the Greek understanding. The word, in fact, in Greek was isonomia, which in fact has different possibilities of understanding, but basically it means equality of share. What did this mean? The right of all citizens to vote in the popular assembly, the right of all, in this case, male citizens, to serve on the law courts and adjudicate trials, the right of all, in this case, male citizens, to be lawmakers, the right and the duty of all, in this case, male citizens, to serve in the army. These were all things in the ancient understanding that were reserved for men. But of course, it's not true to say that only men were citizens. Citizenship could, of course, include women, and the rule was, from the middle of the 5th century onward, that if you were an Athenian citizen, you had to show one Athenian father and one Athenian mother. It was understood in terms of bloodline. So the concept of citizenship, of course, applied to women as well. How did it apply to women? The right of all citizens, male and female, to own property. You could not own immovable property unless you were a citizen. The right of all citizens, male and female, to marry other citizens. You could not marry an Athenian citizen unless you were yourself an Athenian citizen. The right of all citizens, male and female, to a fair trial. We know from the Attic orators that women went to court. It was not just a male concern. And the right of all citizens, male and female, to, that should say, life, I beg your pardon, not life, limb, and liberty. Okay, so the laws, of course, protected male and female, but what we have in the ancient world, or certainly in the Greek democracy, is an asymmetric system. It's not true to say that men and women in the ancient systems of democracy were equal. They were not equal. The political process was reserved for men. Okay, and that's one of the key differences between the ancient and the modern understandings. So let's think about some of the differences. Modern democracies. Okay, in ancient democracies, like modern democracies, all citizens had access to the law. As in modern democracies, all citizens in Athens enjoyed subjective rights that could not be violated. I have a right to my body, I have a right to my property. Others cannot take from me without my permission. That, of course, was respected in law. As in modern democracies, the votes of each citizen were equally weighted. It doesn't matter if you are rich or you are poor, it doesn't matter if you are highly intelligent or not, it doesn't matter if you're highly educated or not, there was an equal understanding of vote. But there are some very, very important differences. Unlike in modern democracies, the Athenians ruled themselves directly. They didn't have a parliament, they didn't have MPs, they didn't send people to a sort of legislative body to make laws on their behalf. They voted for themselves in what was known as the Popular Assembly. Okay, one very important difference. And another very important difference. Unlike in modern democracies, official positions in Athens were rotational. Okay, in modern times, of course, we elect our MPs, our officials, the people who govern for us. In ancient times, of course, there were officials, but in the Athenian system, it was done by a process called sortition. It was a rotational system to make sure that everybody had a turn and everybody had a go, whoever they were. Well, the one big exception to all of this was the strategia, meaning the generalship, which was a directly elected office. There were 10 strategiae every single year, and you could hold that in succession. So that was a meritocracy, but otherwise, officials were done on a rotational basis. And very, very importantly, unlike in modern democracies, only men in the ancient world could participate in the political process. So it wasn't a symmetrical system. Okay, now, we've talked a little bit about some of the similarities and differences. Let's think a little bit about the Athenian Empire at its height. The Athenians acquired a massive empire, which means that they controlled large portions of this area here that you can see, the Aegean Sea. And of course, because Athens had a large population, we think about 250,000, that population had to be fed. And one of the ways in which they fed it, in fact, the most important way that they fed it, was by shipping grain down through the Black Sea from those areas that we think of today as roughly Ukraine, down through the Black Sea, through the Propontis, or what we now think of as the Dardanelles, and down into the Aegean to Athens, to its harbour, the Piraeus, and that's how it was fed. That's how the whole system was kept alive. And of course, it became hugely exploitative. This resulted in two major rival power blocks developing. You had the Athenians on one side, controlling a system of power that was known as the Delian League, where the cities were, broadly speaking, not universally speaking, but broadly speaking, democratic, much like Athens. And then on the other side, you had the land power, the Spartans, who were controlling a group of allies. They weren't all oligarchic, but predominantly they were oligarchic. Sparta had a strange sort of system that was in fact a sort of mixed system. I don't want to get waylaid on that. But these two power blocks came into huge rivalry. It's not unlike the situation in some ways that emerged in Europe after 1945. After the end of the Second World War, you had the Warsaw Pact on one side, and you had NATO on the other side. It's not in some ways different to this. And in the year 431 BC, these two great power blocks came into conflict. The Spartans led various campaigns against Athens, and eventually in the year 404, they managed to defeat Athens by starving Athens into submission. The red dot up there marks a place called Aigos Potamoi, which sort of controlled those narrow straits that control the grain supply from the Black Sea through the Propontis into the Aegean world, which was keeping Athens alive. Terrible defeat, and of course, as a result of that, the Athenians have to concede. Athens, of course, was humiliated. That meant that it had to pull down its defences. It meant that it lost its empire, but most importantly, for the sake of this talk, it meant that its democracy was subverted. Okay, it meant that the democracy was at least temporarily abolished, and it was replaced by a government which we think of, or which was known in the ancient world as the 30 tyrants, or sometimes we just refer to them as the 30. And this was a government that was imposed upon the Athenians by the Spartans. The Spartans had this idea that they were going to control Athens directly and prevent the resurgence of Athenian power by putting this absolutely appalling government, led by this man here, Critias, who was a philosopher of some sort, a very, very nasty man. And the result of all of this was that many, many citizens were driven out, many of them lost their lives, there was bloodshed. We think about 5% of the Athenian population was annihilated in one of the nastiest periods of history that is on record. 8 months later, the oligarchy of the 30 is overthrown, and it's replaced by a democratic system of government again. But the big challenge, of course, for the Athenians was, how are we going to make sure that the horrible events that have happened over the last 8 months are not going to repeat themselves? How are we going to make sure that civil war is not going to become a recurrent problem? And they had this brilliant idea of an amnesty. Okay, now the word amnesty, in fact, again, it's comprised of 2 Greek words. There's your privative alpha, neste, which actually refers to remembrance. It meant that after a particular date, you could not, literally, it means you could not remember events that predated that particular date, the 12th of Boadramian 403. The problem is that, as we know from our sources, there were recollections of these events. It was perfectly permissible in law to refer to the events of the oligarchy that, of course, had been overthrown. We know that this happened. We know that there were records of people who had served under the 30. These records were kept and inscribed. So it wasn't quite a deletion of memory. What was it actually? And what we know from the sources is that the decree of 403 that put an end to the civil war, it provided one very, very important thing. It meant that in the law courts, you could not prosecute somebody for something that happened in that time. Okay? So why is this important? It became, in later antiquity, the example on which all later amnesties were modelled. Cicero, 3-4 centuries later, calls it the vetus Atheniensium exemplum, the ancient Athenian example. It became the model upon which not only ancient amnesties, but indeed modern amnesties, going right down to the 20th century, were modelled. It meant that you could not prosecute citizens for events that predated a certain period, unless, of course, they were big criminals. If they were the 30, if they were the 11 or the 10 who had served under these laws of the 30, then, of course, they could be prosecuted. But if not, there was an understanding that you draw the line. And, of course, that meant that people had to make compromises. It meant that people had to make sacrifices. It meant that you had to put your grievances to bed. And this is not always an easy process. Okay, where do I fit into this debate? As it was mentioned in the introduction, in 2022 I published a book, which you can actually find up in the library here, which goes through these events if you are interested to read further. I talk about the sources and the methods, I talk about the historical background, I talk about the democratic restoration, I talk about the covenants of reconciliation, what were the specific agreements that they swore to. Okay? I talk about the codification of the laws, okay, that came after this, and then I talk about major trials that happened in the wake of the amnesty. One of the big questions that historians have is, well, if the amnesty prohibited legal action for events that happened in that very, very difficult year, why is it that we actually get trials that come after this? And there's a big debate about this, and historians, really from the 19th century onward, have looked at these trials and they have debated. Did the Athenians actually take their law seriously? Did they take the amnesty seriously? Did they actually think about implementing this amnesty properly? I have argued that they have, but not all historians will agree with that, and that's where this becomes a very, very, very interesting and difficult debate. So, I'm not suggesting that any of you should necessarily have an interest in this particular topic. It's one that has preoccupied me for a long time. But what I hope that I have shown, or at least suggested, is that major moments in history can be thousands of years old and still feel relevant today. Think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, for example. Think of the arrangements that were made at the end of the Second World War to put an end to the Nazi period that had happened in Germany. Think about what happened after the fall of communism in 1989. More technically, I suppose 1991, but 1989 is when it went down. All of these systems were resolved by means and by methods of amnesty arrangements. And all of this goes back in one way or another, consciously or subconsciously, to the great example of the Athenians in 403. And there, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to end my talk.